Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this narration of the web series, The Survivor Becomes a Dungeon. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 78, Vidmori Point of View. Well, that fight went about as well as I expected. Between the slight disconnect of having to think about how to move and command my new body, and facing a warrior experienced in combat against other beings of this world, I knew I didn't really stand a chance. However, it was an excellent opportunity to figure out how people in this world fight. After Rhiannon dismissed himself, I was approached by a few people. Trisha and Sylvia were the two I immediately recognized, though. After a couple moments, the names of the remaining two came to mind, that being Miriam and Isaac. I offered a smile at their approach as my hands came up to the black cloth that Historietta wrapped around me. I only had barely noticed that it was starting to unravel and fall off due to it being ripped apart after Rhiannon cut me in half. "Hey there, what's going on?" I asked with a healthy amount of curiosity in my voice as they drew closer. Miriam was the first to speak up, even if it looked like Sylvia was about to speak as well, though she patiently held her tongue and listened as Miriam patted my arm in an encouraging manner. "You did very well out there, Vidmori. I feel that you performed valiantly against a superior opponent, though I am certain that with time you'll be able to reach Rhiannon's level," she enthused cheerfully before looking me over. I was a little surprised by her opening. Had I really performed so poorly that I needed my spirits lifted like that? Well, I can't sense any ill intent from her. In fact, she sounds rather genuine, even if the expressions of those around her betrayed that they felt she made a faux pas. After a moment, I decided just to match her energy and smile a little more. "Well, thank you for your kind words. I shall do my best to get the hang of my new body. Maybe I'll figure out how to make use of my mana heart while I'm at it," I said, before looking amongst the group as a whole and continuing, "Was there anything else?" Sylvia piped up at that as she stepped forward beside Miriam. "Vidmori, if you would allow us to borrow you for a little bit, we would like to take your measurements so that we can get started on making your clothes and armor," she explained, Miriam offering a nod of confirmation at that. Trisha spoke out as she stepped out from behind Miriam and offered a bit of a smile. "And I was hoping to talk a little shop, figure out what sort of weapons you were looking for, and maybe we can see to that forge you've prepared for me," she explained, sounding somewhat hopeful near the end. I couldn't help but smile a bit and nod. "Very well, feel free to take your measurements," I said as I looked between Sylvia and Miriam, though I looked over to Isaac and as he stood close by. "Can I help you with anything?" I offered, since he seemed to be waiting so patiently. Isaac was vaguely surprised when I addressed him, and after he took a moment to look between the others, he shrugged and then looked back at me. I'm just here because I don't have anything better to do," he said simply, as he nodded at his own words. I wasn't sure what to make of that, my head tilting ever so slightly at his words before Miriam grabbed at my arm. "Come on, let's get you inside," she said excitedly, leading me into the longhouse and sitting me on one of the benches along the tables. "Wait right here. I've got to go get my things," she said cheerfully, enough that she stepped away, Sylvia following after to grab her own things. "So," Isaac started to say, trailing off as he seemed to need another moment to gather his thoughts. "When was the first time you killed someone?" he asked, earning him a smack against the back of his head as Trisha frowned at Isaac. "You just sat down. Who starts a conversation like that?" she admonished before looking at me while shaking her head. "Sorry about him. I think he has a bad case of foot and mouth," she explained apologetically to me before staring daggers at Isaac. I couldn't help but offer a kind smile as I leaned back against the table behind me. "It's fine, I don't mind," I offered in response, before looking at Isaac and looking him over. He definitely looks like some kind of warrior between the well-cared-for sword on the hip and the unique set of armor that he wore. "Why do you ask? Have you killed anything or anyone before?" I decided to start with regards to Isaac's question. Isaac averted his gaze, and I could feel the sense of embarrassment coming from him, though about what, I'm not sure. Not really, no. I haven't gotten the chance. I was just a guard recruit before this, a few weeks fresh out of the apprenticeship, and assigned to my own set of city guard armor," he explained, staring at his hands as he wrung them together. I reached out, gently patted his shoulder, and gave him a little shake before putting away. "I don't know what sort of expectations you were raised on in this world, but there's nothing to be ashamed of when it comes to having never killed anyone or anything before. The act of taking a life is a weighty one, and it should never be taken lightly, I explained as I watched him closely. Isak nods intently, and I could see that he had a lot on his mind, though before he could continue, Miriam returned with the tools, followed closely behind Sylvia as the duo set their things down to the table behind me. All right, but Maury, would you mind taking off that wrap? It's too thick to even think about measuring over, she explained politely as she procured a roll of measuring tape. I bobbed my head in response. Sure, no problem, I replied, as I stood before shrugging off the ruined black fabric. As it fell to the ground, I heard an eep sound coming from Miriam, though Sylvia let out an impressed whistle. I couldn't feel the eyes wandering my back and shoulders, and watched the four of them look at my chest and stomach, their eyes tracing the recreation of the injuries I sustained until my late 30s. Sorry if they're disturbing to look at. Medical professionals were few and far between, and dangers were plentiful. I often had to treat my own wounds in the field, and they never were pretty, I explained with a dry chuckle as I rubbed the back of my head. Hell, these aren't even all of them. Revire recreated my body while I was in my prime. I still have a couple decades of wear and tear not present here, I mused, hoping to lighten the mood, though looking over to Miriam, that didn't really seem to help. Well, was all that came from Tricia as she took the seat beside Isak. Miriam just reached out and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. I could feel the unfiltered compassion coming from her as she looked up into my eyes. You sure have been through a lot, haven't you? Nat! Damn. I wasn't expecting that. It's a good thing I'm just wood right now. I have a feeling that some tears might have escaped if I was flesh and blood. I'm able to contain myself well enough as I reach around and gently pat Miriam's hand before putting back. Yeah, but I think I'm in a better place now, I offer in response. I have a feeling that she might not entirely believe me, but she didn't push the topic as she started measuring my arms while Sylvia was about measuring my legs and feet. While that happened, I decided to look back over at Isak and offered a bit of a smile. Let's continue our talk later, if you don't mind, I offered. It's clear that the guy's after something, and I don't want to outright ignore him. This earned Isak a curious look from Miriam, though Isak averts his gaze as he nods. Sure, all right, later, he replied almost sheepishly. After a few moments of silence, Tricia spoke up while staring at the scars along my back. So, Maury, I've got some big questions for you, she said as she stood and walked around in front of me to make eye contact while making sure to stay out of Miriam and Sylvia's way as they measure my chest and hips. Meeting her gaze, I offer a smile and nod. Sure, and I might have some big answers, I replied with amusement. This managed to wrangle a smile from Tricia before she continued with her thought process. What sort of weapons do you want me to make for you? She asked as she held her gaze. Weapons, huh? Right. Now that it has come down to it, what do I want? I trained with all sorts of weapons during my youth, but what should I use now? My mind does wander to the fancy-looking bow next to the elf corpse in Lictrin's chamber, as well as the red spear embedded in the ceiling, but those would just draw too much attention. I also shouldn't limit myself to the gimmick and improvised weapons that I had to rely on more often than not. I had a professional blacksmith with a fully stocked forge and all the supplies I could procure for her. I want a short sword, a dagger, a set of 10 throwing knives, a spear, and a bow with 30 arrows that have barbed tips, I listed out before offering a bit of a smile. I'll let you decide on what to use to make them, but don't use the mithril stuff. I don't want to attract too much attention. Rather than look intimidated by the size of my order, I could swear that she had a fire of excitement in her eyes. Yes, sir. Well, I may need help making the bow and arrows. I should be able to handle making the arrowheads just fine. I'll just be able to manage everything else myself, though. No problem, she exclaimed, as she flashed a toothy grin and thumbs up. Though, after a moment, she had a curious look on her face as she looked over at me. How do you plan to carry all of that? She asked, slightly tilting her head as she stroked her chin. I chuckled softly as Miriam measured my neck while Sylvia took precise measurements of my hand. I have a magic storage place where I can keep it all. Remember how I pulled out all the stone from nowhere? I offered as an example, and after a moment she understands and nods intently. Sylvia spoke up as she finished committing my measurements to memory. Your armor will be simple yet practical, as you obviously don't have any gooey bits that need protecting. But you need to at least look the part, she explained with a hint of amusement while looking me over. Since you like to be light in your feet, I'll get you set up with a set of leather boots, pauldrons, braces, and gloves. You won't look particularly impressive, though I have a feeling you wouldn't care about that, she listed out before nodding to herself with satisfaction. I returned a nod with a bob of my head. Sounds good to me. Just let Lugosi know how many hides you need for the leather. He'll have his pack bring you the materials as long as you let them have the meat, I offer as Miriam pulls away, finishing up with her own measurements. Do you have any preferences for clothes? Miriam asked as she glanced over at me before stepping away to put the measuring tape away. I think about that for a moment before speaking up. I don't have any preferences about the colors of my tops or bottoms. All I ask is that they're all made with long sleeves, I explained, though I considered something else as I glanced over at her. I would like a brown cloak if it isn't too much trouble. She flashes a bit of a smile and nods intently. Of course, but Maury, I'll get right on it, she said cheerfully, moving to leave with Sylvia as they grabbed their equipment. Isaac moved to leave as well, heading outside, though he was soon intercepted by one of the Drake wardens and dragged off somewhere. I took a moment to collect what remained of the black fabric that wrapped around my body, tearing a hole in the middle of one of the bigger pieces before putting it on like a poncho. There we go, at least it won't be exposed, I mused cheerfully to Tricia, earning a bit of a smile from her as she nodded. I could tell that she was clearly excited to see her new workspace. After a moment to consider it, I decided that I should make her first day in my service to be really special. Though at the same time, I wanted to be alone with my thoughts for a little while as I looked over her again. Go get Revia, Rita, and Heftio. I'm going to go on ahead of you and wait for you. This earned a curious look from her as she nodded and went to step away. Sure thing, boss, she replied as she walked off. With Tricia on her way, I started heading up my mountain and got over how the fight went in my head. From what I can tell, Rhiannon managed to circulate his mana through his body. It flowed and pulsated with his heartbeat, much like his own blood. While I don't have blood, I did appear to have some sort of vein circulating a minimal amount of my mana, which was what appeared to keep my body functional and mobile. I had to consider what Rhiannon had told me about his bark skin and the stone skin defense. Based on what I saw, it seemed Rhiannon had to actively will the defenses to take effect. Actually hitting Rhiannon with my stone blade confirmed that there was something at work that reduced the impact of my strike. Reviewing the battle some more, it was clear that Rhiannon had also used a form of mana to cause some kind of whirlwind to spin around his greatsword. The effect of the wind was rather potent, as it was enough to knock me off my feet even without direct contact. It probably didn't help that I'm not as heavy as I used to be, but that is not something I mind all too much. After all, a lighter body means lighter steps. Rhiannon had a decent mana capacity, though it was nowhere near to the extent Revia or even Rita. It was considerable as far as I can tell without refining the mana in his mana heart into mana rings. From the looks of it, mana hearts and mana rings serve two different functions which appear to be complementary to each other. Mana hearts serve to improve physical capabilities in someone's body, spreading the mana around in order to be used in various ways. And with enough skill and know-how, they're able to extend that mana out into a weapon, shield, armor, or even their own skin. Even minor magic can be used as long as someone has mana heart established. That is, if what Heftio told me was accurate when he and Tricia fended off one of those feral goat horses with a burst of fire breath. As far as specifics of mana rings, I'm still not too sure. I'll need to talk to Revia and Rita about it. But it seems the more rings you have, the more complicated the magic you are able to use. I have a feeling that it is like the difference between using a lighter to illuminate a room to using either a torch or a flashlight to illuminate the room. Using a torch or a flashlight are both valid escalations from using a lighter. They're two completely different methods to achieve similar but overtly different effects. Before I knew it, I had been sitting on the steps leading up to the entrance to the smithy while watching the horizon. It was nothing but trees as far as the eye could see, and it was beautiful. The forests around the settlements back home had been gutted for wood and fuel over the years. Conservation wasn't really considered necessary since the world had already ended as far as my generation was concerned. Aside from that, there was usually enough to go around when the supply lines weren't being interrupted by raiders or the communities outside of the alliances. The only things we needed to keep scavenging for were the non-renewable goods and equipment, like the stuff at the warehouse. Things that weren't easily sourced, even if we were making excellent progress with the mass 3D printing, though it all was moot for me now. The musings of my old life came to an end as I spotted Heftio excitedly leading Rita, Revire, and Trisha up along the steps of my mountain. Heftio was the first to reach me, lunging onto my leg as I scooped him up and brought him around to my shoulder. "Glad you all found your way up all right. Sorry to wake you, Revire," I mentioned apologetically at the sight of the elven woman. Revire yawned, shrugging but flashing a smile. "It's all right. You wouldn't have woken me for nothing after all." Rita looked around curiously, not having been at this part of my mountain yet. I looked over at Trisha and waved her over. "Come along, your forge awaits," I said cheerfully as we all headed up the rest of the way. Within a few minutes, I led the group down the magically illuminated tunnel and into the forge room. Trisha, for her part, was ecstatic as she moved from one end of the room to the other, before hopping around with a grin on her face before going over to Heftio and scooping up the cat. "Heftio, the fires of the forge await!" she exclaimed, Heftio moralling with delight as she wiggled about excitedly. I couldn't help but grin how excited she was, but I cleared my throat and spoke up. "Before you get started, we have a bit of business to attend to." Trisha looked fairly surprised, but nodded as she clutched Heftio close. "Oh, sure, boss, what's up?" "Do you have a last name?" I asked curiously. Trisha looked taken aback by my apparently random question. No? Are you offering?" I chuckled a bit at her reaction before nodding. "Yeah, among other things. I would like to form a bond with you if you are interested. I'll grant you a last name and a title. These two things will grant you a considerable amount of power and allow you to communicate with all my non-verbal beasts," I explained, gesturing to Heftio as Trisha glanced down at the red cat and looked rather thoughtful. Trisha starts to say, lifting Heftio up and looking him in the eyes. Heftio offered a feline smile and gently pressed his paw against her cheek. Trisha chuckled a bit before bringing him back down to her chest and looking over at me. "I'll do it, thank you." I nodded intently and looked over at Rita and Revire. "Do you mind coming over? Trisha has a mana heart but no mana ring, and I have a feeling that she's going to need some help forming her first ring." Revire and Rita share a glance before nodding as they approach, the two women placing their hands on Trisha's back. Trisha looked rather confused at the mention of mana rings and gulped with anxiety, though she remained still. After another moment of considering what I wanted to say, I approached Trisha and looked down into her eyes before placing a hand on her shoulder. "I welcome you into my service. I grant you the title of Arsonist and bestow you the last name Vulcan. May you grow and become your best self as we go together into the future." At that, the 2 doses of mana start flowing into her. Strangely enough, it doesn't flow from my avatar, and is instead flowing down from the core above as Trisha jolts and shudders from the rush of mana. Thankfully, both Rita and Revire set to work and quickly stabilized the teen blacksmith, her mana heart growing and pulsing dramatically when a ring starts to spiral and swirl around it. Trisha, panting heavily, clutches her chest and shuddering, looking between Rita and Revire, before looking over to me and flashing a wild grin. "Oh, what a rush! Say, what is an arsonist?" End of chapter. I would like to thank the T5 peeps, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Bushmaster 177, Leslie 517, Red Panda 121, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Lightsjoc, Dragzoon W.R.E, Lord Azrekahl, Severin Cerberus, and Arcadian. Thank you very much.